Willkommen in einem anderen Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 49 of my game system design series. In this video I'll investigate how scale affects the figure gaming experience, specifically ground scale and Napoleonic figure gaming. While creating standard playing areas for Napoleonics, World War II and Cold War figure gaming, I discovered an interesting effect of ground scale. I'm currently creating standard playing areas using historical Napoleonic battlefields. I'm also using historical World War II battlefields, but for the most part, my focus in this video is Napoleonic. Most of my original historical playing areas are based on the SPI quad games. When I converted these playing areas into a standard 3x4 foot playing area, the scale generally sat around about 1 in 10,000. A few battlefields, such as Marengo's, used the lower scale, about 1 in 8,000, and one battlefield, Leipzig, used the higher scale, about 1 in 20,000. While creating these historical playing areas, I was not really concerned about scale, as I was converting the SPI board games into a figure gaming scenario, and the time and figure scale was simply adjusted to match the ground scale, in the same way the board game did. However, after I created these playing areas, I wasn't entirely happy with this, so instead of adjusting the unit and time scale to match the playing area, I'm now fixing the ground scale to my base widths for the rules that I'm using. The base ground scales I'm using is either 1 in 8,000 or 1 in 16,000, which is the two scales that I'm currently using for 4 centimeter wide bases in movement trays. While this is not really important to the discussion, my elements represent 2,000 men or 4,000 men, they're the two choices, and represent a frontage of either 400 metres or 800 metres respectively. The cavalry scale is 1,600 or 3,200 with the same frontage. The base widths without movement tray is 4 centimetres, which means in that case the element has a scale of 1 in 10,000 if the frontage is 400 metres, and 1 in 20,000 if the element frontage is 800 metres. However, when you use movement trays, the width changes to 5 centimetres for each element. This is because of the lip on each end of the movement tray, which means the ground scale now changes to 1 in 8,000 or 1 in 16,000 instead of 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 20,000 when I do not use movement trays. This scale depends on the rules used. However, after looking at Napoleonic battlefields, you do actually need a scale of 1 in 8,000 at least, or alternatively, or better, 1 in 10,000, and the other option of 1 in 16,000 or 1 in 20,000 if you're using a playing area of 3 by 4 feet. If your playing area is 6 by 8 feet, the scales halve, which is also a viable scale, but as the number of elements go up dramatically, is not really suitable for a one-day game. Now, I just threw a lot of numbers your way in order to provide some background info. If these numbers are confusing, do not be concerned, as fully understanding the detail is not important in understanding the point I'm attempting to make, as the point of this video is exploring how ground scale affects your actual figure game. In simple terms, I'm looking at battlefields with two basic scales, 1 in 8,000 and 1 in 16,000. And while I was doing this, I noticed something very interesting in my gameplays or my test games. Before I actually drill into specific battlefields and maps, I just need to explain a few points about the maps. The first is all the maps that I'll be showing have red boxes. Each box represents a 30 centimeter square, or just under 1 foot square. If players double the size of the box, the ground scale is halved. So if 1 in 8,000 with 30 centimetre, it will now become 1 in 4,000. If players halve the size of the box, the ground scale is doubled. So if it was previously 1 in 16,000, it now becomes 1 in 32,000. Other increases or decreases will obviously affect the scale accordingly. The second point is all the maps I'm using in this video are original maps, as you can see on the left. I do convert all my maps into something which can be converted into a figure gaming playing area, as you can see on the right, but these will not be included in this video. In most cases, all the maps I'm going to show have an axis which is no more than 3 boxes or 90 centimetres in depth. There are exceptions where I had no choice, but I generally do not recommend these playing areas. The reason is all the playing areas are designed for players to be seated for the bulk of the game. With a depth of 90 centimetres, a seated player can, with some effort, reach 90 centimetres, can reach out at least 60 centimetres with no effort, and even 90 centimetres with a bit of effort. If players do not need to remain seated for the entire game length, then they can increase the size of the red grids to create larger playing areas. If players need to always remain seated, the optimal width of a playing area is closer to 76 centimetres, which is the width of a standard fold-out table. Reducing the size of the grid can be attempted, however this does affect the unit scale. If players do not wish to change the unit scale, they can use smaller base widths or element widths. These maps are designed for 4 centimetre wide elements in 5 centimetre wide movement trays. If you do not use movement trays, the size of the playing area can be reduced by 20%, or each red square now becomes a 24 centimetre square. This allows you to have a playing area which is 72 centimetres deep. If you use 3 centimetre wide bases with, let's say, 10mm or 6mm figures, the squares can be further reduced to 18 centimetre squares, which allows you to increase the size of the battlefield covered by the playing area. My next project is to use 3 centimetre square bases with 6mm or 10mm figures, which can allow me to increase the size of the battlefield or reduce the unit scale. I'm also going to use the US basing with 15mm figures to achieve the same objective. Let's start with Austerlitz. This is a 1 in 8,000 scale playing area, which in this case is 6 feet wide by 3 feet deep. You could cut it down to 5 feet wide by 3 feet deep if you wished, as there is unused space on the left. But I use 2 by 3 foot segments in my playing area, and I need this particular size. If I dropped it down to 3 by 4, I can't fit the entire battlefield on my playing area. Just a quick note, my extended width size is a perfectly acceptable for a one-day game as well. The Allies have about 60 elements and the French a similar number, so this can be played within 3 hours. If you go for a larger playing area, such as 6 by 8, which means it's deeper, the number of elements move up to about 120 and it would take 6 hours to play. But I want to focus on smaller playing areas for our exercise. The result is a perfectly acceptable ground and unit scale. That's the objective, which would give you a typically enjoyable Napoleonic game within a one-day period, preferably around about 4 hours. Let's look what happens when we move to 1 in 16,000 scale. The first point is the axis has changed, with a lot more real estate behind each side. The second point is you can include a lot of pre-battle manoeuvring. The third point is there are open flanks. Many rules have problems dealing with open flanks, and I must admit the SPI Napoleonic War rules do have this issue. This can be resolved with simple command control rules, which I have done with my figure game conversion, Grosse Schlachten. In terms of element count, with a change in unit scale, each side has about 30 elements now, which gives you a very quick game. In theory, you could play this on a 2 by 3 foot playing area, but I actually prefer the larger playing area. The main difference between these two scales is the scale of 1 in 8,000 requires both sides to be fully deployed for the battle at the beginning. There is no pre-battle manoeuvring. At 1 in 16,000 scale, you could start the game with both forces moving onto the playing area, or at least one side doing so. There is, in summary, pre-battle manoeuvring occurring. Let's now look at Jena Osterdatz. This is a 1 in 16,000 scale playing area which is 6 feet wide by 3 feet deep, perfectly acceptable. This allows you to refight the entire Jena Osterdatz campaign, which includes all the manoeuvring which resulted in the situation occurring as it did. This shows a 1 in 8,000 scale playing area of the Jena battlefield, which would allow you to fight this battle in a traditional manner, but there is no pre-battle manoeuvring. This is the Austerdatz battlefield, which I personally feel is the more interesting conflict. Both battles, in this case, would need to be fought separately. Once again, very little pre-battle manoeuvring in this case. In our next example, we'll see a battlefield which may not be suitable for a scale of 1 in 8,000, which is Vergam. In this example, we require a playing area of 4 by 6 feet, and as you can see by the flanks, especially left flank, you'll be missing some critical manoeuvring room. This playing area is viable, but it's certainly not optimal or perfect. The other issue is the size of the armies. At this scale, the Austrians would field about 80 elements and the French about 100. This results in a lot of elements, although with a simple set of rules such as Napoleonic War or my figure game conversion, grosse Schlachten, this is not really a big issue. If using a more complex set of rules, it becomes a major issue. At 1 in 16,000 scale, the battle becomes significantly more viable, with the flanks available and the Austrian manoeuvring on the French left flank possible. The element count also drops to something more viable for more complex sets of rules. The Battle of Friedland is the same. At 1 in 16,000 scale, we can cover the entire battle, including the arrival of French forces and the Russian retreat. If we go to a scale of 1 in 8,000, we need a much larger playing area, 4 by 6 feet, in order to include all aspects of the battle, and we do miss out on the French rear areas, which may not be that important, but nonetheless means very little pre-battle manoeuvring. Some battles are small enough to only need a scale of 1 in 8,000, as this example of Marengo shows. 1814 includes a lot of smaller battles, but apart from a very few, they tend to not be that decisive. Nonetheless, these can be refought using a scale of 1 in 8,000 only. We do not need to go to 1 in 16,000. Eylau is another example where you only need to consider a scale of 1 in 8,000. Salamanca is also quite similar. It's another good battle to refight at a scale of 1 in 8,000. We have yet another example of a battle which can easily use a scale of 1 in 8,000, which in this case is Vittoria. In terms of elements, the French would field about 48 elements and the Allies about 60 elements. This would be a good historical battle to refight. In theory, Aspern-Esslen only needs a scale of 1 in 8,000, but you need to carefully schedule the forces which are fed into this battle. The reason why you can get away with 1 in 8,000 is because the battle was so incredibly concentrated in a very small spot. If you use a scale of 1 in 16,000, you could start the battle with a French crossing and position all the Austrian forces in their historical position, ready to advance forward as required. This battle can be fought at both scales, but at 1 in 16,000 you do get to perform a lot of the manoeuvring behind the French line, which was actually critical and which you cannot do at a scale of 1 in 8,000. Other battles tend to be borderline. This shows Borodino at 1 in 8,000. Most of the battlefield where fighting occurs is covered, but it does not cover the Russian forces off on the left of the screen, which did come down to assist, as you can see by the dotted lines. Using this battlefield, you can refight the original plans of each side. However, you could not conduct any of the fighting which occurred before the battle, or you could not certainly do any alternate strategies. To give you an idea of the size of the force mix, using my standard scale, the French would probably field about 90 plus elements and the Russians about 100 plus elements. This would not be suitable for a complex set of rules, but for Napoleonic War or my figure game conversion, grosse Schlachten, it would probably take about 4 to 6 hours to game. This shows Borodino at 1 in 16,000 scale. This shows the entire Russian position and would allow you to refight the conflict which occurred before the full battle occurred. The bottom of the map is cut off, but if you included the actual terrain, which is blank here, you would see the road which carried French reinforcements. In summary, you could refight the entire Borodino campaign, and you could try different strategies or tactics. For an idea of the number of elements using the scale of 1 in 16,000, the French would probably field about 48 elements and the Russians about 50 to 60 elements. This force mix would be suitable for a complex set of rules, but for Napoleonic War or grosse Schlachten, the game would probably take about 2 to 3 hours to play. Incidentally, I had an issue with the scale here. The scale at the top left corner of the map I was using is wrong. In the end, I had to determine the distance between two towns to determine the correct scale. I'm uncertain why this was the case or why the error occurred, but I did verify it against two other maps, and I did verify it was actually incorrect, which really threw me when I was originally designing this map. For some battles, such as Leipzig, the scale of 1 in 8,000 is simply not viable. You could create a playing area which included the main fighting which occurred on the first day, but this would not include the Prussian attack in the rear and the subsequent encirclement which occurred in the following 2 days. On the other hand, if you use a scale of 1 in 16,000, we can now include the entire battlefield. Because this battle was so large, there is not much manoeuvring going on, even at this scale, but at least you can refight the entire battle if you so desire. This is physically impossible at a scale of 1 in 8,000, unless you had a 6 by 8 foot playing area. Incidentally, I did create a playing area like this, but only tried one game and discovered it was simply not practical. We've been going through a number of historical battles at various scales, and the question you may be asking yourself now is, why does it matter? As long as a battle can fit in the playing area, why would I care what the scale happens to be? It's a good question, and it really only matters if you want to decide how the armies move into their position for the battle. In summary, it only matters if you wish to conduct a plan which did not occur in history, basically if you wanted to do pre-battle manoeuvring. If you are okay with refighting the plans the original historical general set, with some maybe tactical changes during the battle possible, then there is no need to have a lot of real estate around the actual conflict. One of my gaming comrades I knew told me that there's a simple test to determine what type of game a player wants. If you want it to be able to form a square, then you don't really care about changing history and you just wish to refight the historical plans. If you don't care about forming square, then you may be more inclined to want to command corps or armies and refight historical battles using your own personal plan. Both type of gamers have their place, but the type of game is different as a result. On a humorous note, while refighting Wagram at 1 in 16,000 scale, my comrade who gave me the forming square test was annoyed when he discovered cavalry was so rare and seemingly weak. He specifically was annoyed his French cuirassiers did not have some unique combat benefit which would allow it to charge into a massive column of 12,000 infantry in column. However, once he worked out that at that scale that was the reality of commanding the French at Wagram, he quickly focused on sending his infantry to crush the Austrian left flank. I must point out that the French cuirassiers were a significant force to be considered, but at an element scale of 1 in 3,200, the French only get 2 cuirassier elements, which were more powerful than light cavalry, and their speed was very useful in plugging up a gap in the French line, which historically did occur. The battle did not go as it did in real life, as he avoided the error Napoleon or his subordinates made, but the game was a recreation of the actual battle, and each player needed to concern himself with whole corps and armies, not just cuirassier regiments. Let's look at a simple example. In this case, the playing area is as large as the battle, with little unused real estate. Both armies are formed up close to each other. While some rearrangement could be conducted, if you are playing to a game turn limit, an attacker cannot waste time reorganising their forces, or his forces, and can only make minor changes which do not delay the attack. So they're locked into the original historical plan. If we're using a playing area with a lot more real estate, the force mixes in terms of elements will be less, and often the attacker will start off the playing area or very close to the attacker edge, with the defender well behind in their defensive position. In this case, the attacker can choose which flank to focus on, and the defender can choose how to defend. Often the result is the player will follow the historical plan, unless of course the historical commander was a fool. There is actually one problem with playing areas much larger than the actual historical battle, which is the forces spread out along the front line like a drop of ink on a glass of water, or in a glass of water. This is a major issue with the original SPI Napoleonic War game system, which is partially controlled by restricting the size of the playing area, but it is anything but perfect, and many other rules have this problem. The solution is, of course, command control, also limiting the game turns. The problem is how to implement it in a simple manner, as complex command control rules can dramatically increase the time to play a game, which kind of defeats the purpose of having quick games. I did find the answer in a SPI pre-stag board game, which had about the simplest command control rule you could ever possibly imagine. If an element was not in command control, its movement was halved, and it could not attack the enemy. Simple. This may be too simple for many players, but it works and solves the problem very well. After I created this video, I did add this kind of command control to my Grosse Schlachten, or my Napoleonic War conversion, and it worked quite well in solving this issue with minimal gameplay impact. Let's briefly look at World War II and Cold War games. Strangely enough, this scale issue was never an issue, as most World War II or Cold War gamers know you need lots of room to maneuver. Otherwise, you end up with a less than exciting World War I situation. Just to note, World War I type battles are viable and would consist of forces staring at each other, but I just currently do not feel they make for very interesting games, so I generally avoid them. This shows an example of a typical Cold War playing area. It's based on the SPI Würzburg board game, and in simple terms, the Soviets drive down the right edge towards the enemy left edge, or the left edge. SPI has about a dozen scenarios which have the defenders on the right side of the river, or the left side of the river, or a combination of both. It all depends on the force mix. As a quick side note, I quickly discovered that the Napoleonic playing areas that I'd been created were also suitable for World War II or Cold War games. My massive Leipzig playing area has proved to be very useful in refighting Cold War battles as well as World War II. You just need to get the scenario details correct. And so we come to an end of my episode 49 of my video series on game design theory. In this case, understanding how ground scale affects the type of games players play, want or do not want. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.